Yesterday, President Trump addressed last week's stock market turmoil caused by confusion around his tariff agenda.
It is now becoming clear that tariff increases will be significantly larger than expected. And the same is likely to be true of the economic.
We inherited a terrible economy, as you know.
In a move that defies decades of unspoken agreement, Japan, America's loyal financial partner, executed an unprecedented sell-off of $1.7 trillion in United States Treasury bonds. And this will change everything. For years, Japan's billions flowed into American debt, propping up the dollar and fueling Washington's spending. But suddenly, Tokyo pulled the plug, unleashing chaos on Wall Street. Bond yields spiked, the dollar trembled, and global markets plunged into turmoil. Amid the panic, one burning question emerged: why would Japan, a pillar of America's financial empire, choose to shatter the unbreakable bond of trust? The answer, it turns out, lies in Washington's staggering political arrogance. And this is just the start of it. Stick with us as we unravel how this seismic shift could redefine your financial future and the fate of the global economy. The day Washington lost control, the United States thought tariffs would protect its economy. Instead, they triggered its downfall. It began with a policy decision wrapped in patriotism but driven by protectionism. Under President Donald Trump's administration, the United States government imposed steep tariffs on imported electric vehicles, including those from Japanese automakers like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan. The goal was clear: shield American automakers such as Tesla, General Motors, and Ford from foreign competition. What Washington failed to grasp was how deeply that decision would cut. For decades, Japan had led the world in hybrid and electric vehicle innovation. It was Toyota that first changed the game with the Prius. It was Nissan that brought electric vehicles to the masses with the Nissan Leaf. This was not just business to Japan, it was national pride, technological dominance, and economic identity. To Tokyo, the tariffs felt like a slap in the face, a rejection of decades of partnership. Negotiations failed. Meetings behind closed doors went nowhere. Instead of compromise, Washington doubled down, forcing Japan's most iconic industries into a corner. But Japan had a weapon Washington overlooked. It wasn't steel. It wasn't cars. It was money. The decision to liquidate $1.7 trillion in Treasury bonds was no impulsive act. It was financial retaliation, a way to strike at the very heart of America's economic machine, without firing a single shot. By dumping American debt, Japan signaled to Washington and the world, if you attack our industries, we will attack your economy. The bond sell-off was not merely a reaction, it was a strategic escalation, and the consequences would soon ripple across every trading floor and family home in America, which we will get to in a sec right after you hit that subscribe button. Thanks. How $5 trillion vanished overnight. In 3 weeks, Wall Street lost $5 trillion, and it started with a single decision. The shock of Japan's bond sell-off hit the financial markets like a wrecking ball. It wasn't just the numbers on the screen. It was the confidence behind those numbers that evaporated. The sell-off triggered an immediate spike in Treasury bond yields. As Japan flooded the market with bonds, prices fell, and interest rates surged. That ripple quickly turned into a tsunami. Institutional investors scrambled to adjust their portfolios. Hedge funds offloaded stocks in panic. Foreign governments watched nervously, wondering if they too should cut their losses and sell American debt. By the end of 3 weeks, $5 trillion in market value had been wiped out. The American stock market entered a tailspin. Blue chip stocks tumbled. Pension funds saw catastrophic losses. Millions of retail investors, ordinary Americans, watched their retirement accounts shrink overnight. The financial media tried to explain it away. Some claimed it was a market correction. Others blamed global uncertainty. But anyone paying attention knew the truth. It wasn't the market correcting itself. It was Japan, quietly pulling the pin on a financial grenade that had been sitting in America's pocket for decades. And while Wall Street reeled, the pain was only just beginning to reach Main Street. American middle class caught in the crossfire. The real victims weren't in Washington or Tokyo. They were in every American household. As the dust settled on the bond sell-off and market crash, the aftershocks began to ripple through the lives of ordinary people. For families already struggling with rising prices, the consequences felt like a sucker punch. Inflation surged as the dollar weakened. The cost of imported goods skyrocketed. Everyday essentials, from groceries to gasoline, became more expensive. The tariffs on Japanese electric vehicles, combined with the collapsing dollar, pushed car prices to historic highs. For many Americans, the dream of owning a new electric vehicle suddenly slipped out of reach. It didn't stop there. Mortgage rates climbed as Treasury yields spiked. First-time homebuyers were locked out of the market. Those with adjustable-rate mortgages saw their payments balloon overnight. Credit card interest rates soared, draining household budgets even further. Meanwhile, wages remained stagnant. The average American worker watched helplessly as their paycheck bought less every month. Savings evaporated. Retirement plans were thrown into disarray. And all of it traced back to a single decision: to wage an economic war without considering the cost to those who could least afford it. But the middle class's pain wasn't the end of this crisis. As the financial pressure mounted, something even more dangerous was brewing in the halls of power and in the streets of America. What began as a financial retaliation was about to trigger a global economic rebellion. Because Japan's move didn't just shake Wall Street, it cracked the entire foundation of America's economic dominance. And Washington had no idea what was coming next. Japan joins the anti-dollar rebellion. When Tokyo quietly sold off hundreds of billions of dollars in United States Treasury bonds, it wasn't simply a reaction to tariffs. It was a signal, a battle cry to other nations who had grown tired of American financial dominance. For decades, Japan had been the most reliable financier of United States debt, buying up Treasury bonds to keep the American economy afloat. But now, the very country that Washington thought would always play by its rules had flipped the board. Behind closed doors, Tokyo's decision-makers were no longer asking how to preserve their alliance with the United States. They were asking how to survive without it. The sell-off was just the beginning. Japanese financial leaders began coordinating quietly with other major economies who shared the same grievance: the dollar's stranglehold over global finance. China had already begun to reduce its dollar reserves. Russia had long abandoned United States assets following years of sanctions. South Korea, India, and even smaller Southeast Asian economies were quietly shifting their financial strategies. But none of them had the global financial credibility that Japan carried. Tokyo's decision gave these nations cover, a respected player making the first move, legitimizing what many had been too afraid to do. Together, they started laying the groundwork for something far more dangerous than a trade war. They were preparing to abandon the dollar altogether. But what came next would reveal how far Japan's betrayal really went, and who stood to benefit: the birth of a new Asian financial order. The United States dollar's greatest threat wasn't China. It was Japan's quiet betrayal. While headlines in Washington remained fixated on tariffs and market crashes, something much bigger was happening behind the scenes. Tokyo wasn't just dumping treasury bonds. It was redirecting its vast financial resources into Asia and reshaping the future of global finance. For years, Japan's capital had flowed into American assets, supporting the dollar, stabilizing Wall Street, and keeping American borrowing costs low. But after decades of being treated like a junior partner in the American-led financial system, Japan had finally had enough. The decision to sell off United States bonds was not made in isolation. It was part of a broader pivot, a strategic investment shift aimed at building a regional financial order independent of the dollar. Billions of dollars started flowing into Southeast Asian markets. Japan expanded bond purchases from China, South Korea, and India. It increased investments in ASEAN development funds. It extended currency swap agreements across the region, reducing the need for dollar-backed transactions. This wasn't economic retaliation anymore. It was economic re-engineering. China quickly welcomed Japan's move. For years, Beijing had been trying to build an alternative to the dollar. But without Tokyo, those efforts lacked credibility. Now, Japan's financial power gave the project real weight. South Korea and India joined the conversation, along with smaller players like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaysia. Quiet summits were held, policies drafted, deals signed, all away from American cameras. The United States financial establishment barely noticed. They were too distracted by falling bond prices and stock market chaos to see that the ground beneath their feet was being pulled away. But how did Washington miss this betrayal? The answer lay in its own arrogance. How Washington's arrogance lost Japan. The United States believed Japan would never bite the hand that fed it. They were wrong. For decades, American policymakers operated under a dangerous assumption that Japan's economic dependence on the dollar guaranteed its loyalty. They pointed to the post-war alliance, the trade partnerships, the shared military interests. They believed that no matter how many tariffs were imposed, no matter how much Washington weaponized its financial system, Japan would quietly absorb the punishment. That arrogance blinded American leadership to years of rising resentment in Tokyo. Japan had watched as the United States imposed tariffs on its automakers, blocked its technology exports, and treated it as a junior partner in trade negotiations. It had endured decades of dollar dominance while struggling with its own stagnant economy and ballooning debt. Each time Japan tried to assert itself, it was told to fall back in line. The final insult came with the tariffs on electric vehicles. Japan's proudest industry, its global technology leadership, was treated like a threat rather than an asset. Washington's policies crossed a line, one that Tokyo had warned about privately for years. When Japan's bond sell-off began, American officials dismissed it as a temporary protest. They underestimated how deeply the resentment had grown. They failed to see that Japan no longer believed in the old rules of financial loyalty. They believed the United States system was too big to fail, too powerful to challenge. They were wrong. And as Japan quietly walked away, other nations were watching and preparing to follow. The dominoes start falling. Japan's move was just the first. Others quickly followed. Once the world's third largest economy publicly challenged the dollar's dominance, the floodgates opened. South Korea began to reduce its holdings of United States Treasury bonds, citing concerns over market stability and financial exposure. India accelerated its diversification strategy, increasing gold reserves and reducing dollar-backed assets. Taiwan quietly shifted portions of its sovereign wealth funds into regional bonds. These weren't symbolic gestures, they were seismic shifts in global finance. For the first time in decades, the unthinkable was happening. The world's largest economies were coordinating to untether themselves from the dollar. What fueled this movement wasn't just economics, it was distrust. Years of American financial dominance had bred resentment. Trade wars, sanctions, tariffs, and the weaponization of the dollar had pushed even America's closest allies to question whether their futures should remain tied to Washington's political whims. The domino effect spread beyond Asia. Latin American nations began holding talks on regional financial cooperation. Middle Eastern oil exporters quietly explored non-dollar trading mechanisms. The European Union, frustrated by escalating trade tensions with the Trump administration, reopened discussions on a digital euro to bypass the dollar in global trade. The dollar wasn't under attack by enemies. It was being abandoned by former friends. And while Washington scrambled to contain the financial fallout, it failed to see what was coming next. Because the most devastating blow was no longer financial, it was political. And that battle was about to begin. Trump's all-out economic war against Japan. The moment Tokyo unloaded $1.7 trillion in United States Treasury bonds, Washington responded not with diplomacy, but with a hammer. President Trump announced the most aggressive economic retaliation against Japan in modern history. With one sweeping order, his administration imposed maximum tariffs on virtually all Japanese goods entering American ports. From automobiles to electronics, consumer appliances to industrial machinery. Everything was hit. The tariffs reached as high as 100%, a historic escalation that shattered decades of post-war economic partnership. The White House justified this move as necessary to protect American jobs and framed Japan's bond sell-off as an act of economic warfare. Trump's rhetoric became even more dangerous when he threatened to sanction Japanese banks, accusing them of undermining American financial stability. Japanese automakers like Toyota, Nissan, and Honda, already battered by previous electric vehicle tariffs, now faced existential threats to their business in the United States. Tokyo's response was cold and calculated. Japanese officials described Trump's tariffs as reckless economic aggression and vowed to accelerate financial decoupling from the American market. Japanese investors began quietly withdrawing from Wall Street, while Tokyo initiated talks with Beijing and Seoul to coordinate financial policies. What started as retaliation had now turned into a full-scale economic war. But Trump wasn't done. The fire he lit in the Pacific quickly spread across the Atlantic. The European front ignites. As Japan burned bridges, Trump opened fire on Europe. Days after escalating tariffs on Japanese goods, he unleashed a 200% tariff on French, Italian, and Spanish wines, champagnes, and alcoholic beverages. The announcement blindsided European leaders. Trump justified the tariffs by pointing to European Union taxes on American steel and aluminum, claiming they were unfair and anti-American. The impact was immediate. French and Italian wine exporters called the tariffs catastrophic, estimating billions in potential losses. European media outlets labeled Trump's move as economic blackmail, accusing Washington of weaponizing trade to strong-arm its allies. Brussels hit back hard. The European Union retaliated with a new round of tariffs on American agricultural products, luxury goods, and even tech exports. Wine producers in Bordeaux and Tuscany protested alongside American soybean farmers and whiskey distillers, each side feeling the financial pain of a trade war they did not start. What made this escalation even more dangerous was its timing. The global economy was already shaken by Japan's bond sell-off. Wall Street had lost trillions. Inflation was rising. The dollar's dominance was under threat. Now the European Union and the United States were openly fighting over trade, threatening to unravel the very system that had kept global commerce stable for decades. As European markets convulsed and American farmers faced new tariffs, the cracks in Washington's foreign policy strategy widened. And waiting just across the northern border was another ally ready to make a move of its own. Canada turns its back on America. Even America's closest neighbor walked away. For decades, Canada had been Washington's most reliable partner, economically, militarily, and diplomatically. But in the shadow of Trump's tariff war, Ottawa made a strategic pivot that caught the world's attention. But before we talk about what they did, take a moment to subscribe. It helps us a lot. Thanks. The Canadian government accelerated trade and defense deals with Australia, the European Union, and Southeast Asian nations. In a matter of months, Canada signed agreements worth over $7 billion in combined trade and defense partnerships. These deals included a $6 billion Canadian contract to purchase long-range radar systems from Australia, reducing Canada's dependence on American defense infrastructure. The message was clear. Canada no longer trusted the unpredictability of American policy. Ottawa also expanded its trade agreements with the European Union, locking in preferential access to markets that Washington was now alienating. Canadian officials described these moves as a necessary insurance policy against American economic volatility. But it wasn't just about trade and defense contracts. Canada began reducing its financial exposure to the American market, cutting back on holdings of United States Treasury bonds and diversifying its foreign reserves. The era of North American economic unity was coming to an end. This shift wasn't lost on global observers. As Canada moved away from its historic alliance with the United States, the geopolitical map of the Western Hemisphere started to change. And nowhere was that shift more visible than in the Arctic. America loses the Arctic. The North was America's last frontier until Canada locked it down. For years, the United States had relied on Canada to maintain stability and access to the Arctic, a region rich in untapped resources and critical shipping routes. But as trade wars erupted and alliances crumbled, Canada made a decisive move to protect its northern sovereignty without Washington's involvement. Ottawa announced a comprehensive Arctic defense overhaul. It began deploying state-of-the-art long-range radar systems purchased from Australia, capable of detecting airborne threats across 3,000 kilometers. For the first time in decades, Canada was building an Arctic defense strategy independent of American military systems. The implications were enormous. Control of Arctic shipping lanes, oil reserves, and strategic airspace had long been a cornerstone of American power. But with Canada asserting its sovereignty and strengthening partnerships with Australia, Europe, and Asian allies, the United States found itself increasingly isolated. The shift created opportunities for other powers. Russia, already expanding its military presence in the Arctic, welcomed Canada's decision to distance itself from American defense policy. China began increasing investments in Arctic infrastructure, sensing an opening to project influence in the region. For Washington, it was a geopolitical nightmare. In a matter of months, economic retaliation had spiraled into a full-scale global trade war, and now America's own backyard was slipping out of its control. The Arctic, once a symbol of American dominance, was now a contested frontier. But the true cost of this cascading conflict was about to hit home, not in foreign capitals, but in the wallets of ordinary American families. Stagflation returns. How the crisis crushed the U.S. economy. You can't win a trade war when your own economy is bleeding. As tariffs skyrocketed, allies defected, and global markets spiraled, the American economy slipped into something far more terrifying than recession: stagflation. Prices soared, but paychecks didn't. Jobs disappeared, but costs kept climbing. For millions of Americans, it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath their feet. The numbers told a grim story. Inflation climbed past 8%, the highest in nearly 4 decades. Unemployment crept back toward double digits. Mortgage rates climbed, grocery bills doubled, and the American middle class, the so-called backbone of the economy, found itself gasping for air. Washington insisted it was temporary, but the pain in households from Ohio to Oklahoma said otherwise. Confidence in the American dream evaporated almost overnight. For years, voters had been promised that tariffs would bring back manufacturing, that cutting ties with foreign markets would create jobs at home. Instead, shelves emptied, bills piled up, and American families bore the cost of a trade war they never asked for. But the most dangerous consequence of this economic collapse wasn't the numbers. It was the rage building beneath them. As prices spiked and wages stagnated, American workers stopped waiting for relief. They decided to fight back. The worker uprising. No one saw coming. They were promised prosperity. Instead, they got pink slips. As factories closed and costs surged, American workers realized they had been sold a lie. The tariffs that were supposed to protect their jobs had destroyed them instead. Entire manufacturing towns across the Midwest and South became graveyards of shuttered plants, their parking lots empty, their machines silent. And the workers? They refused to go quietly. The first strikes began in Michigan, but they spread like wildfire. Auto workers walked off the job. Steel workers followed. Then teachers, truck drivers, and retail employees. By the time the dust settled, over 5 million Americans were on strike, the largest labor uprising since the 1930s. Their message was simple: enough. Union leaders pointed the blame squarely at the White House. They accused President Trump of waging a reckless economic war that left American workers as collateral damage. Once loyal voters who had cheered Trump's tariffs now marched in picket lines, demanding not just higher wages, but an end to the policies that had gutted their communities. The media branded it the Great Worker Revolt, but it was more than a headline. It was a movement, a rebellion against broken promises and economic betrayal. And as the strikes intensified, another betrayal was quietly unfolding on Wall Street. Wall Street's final betrayal. The markets Trump once bragged about finally turned on him. For years, Wall Street tolerated Trump's chaos because the numbers looked good. Stocks were up. Corporate profits soared. Billionaires got richer. But when Japan dumped $1.7 trillion in American bonds and the global economy unraveled, the markets lost their patience. Corporate donors pulled their campaign contributions. Hedge funds moved their capital offshore. Chief executive officers who once toasted Trump at black tie galas now called for new leadership. Financial news networks openly questioned whether the president had become a liability for the American economy. The political fallout was immediate. Republican lawmakers, sensing blood in the water, began to distance themselves. Poll numbers plummeted. The business elite who had once treated Trump as their golden ticket now abandoned him, leaving the administration politically isolated and financially cornered. Wall Street's betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come with press conferences or protests. It came with capital flight, collapsing stock indexes, and private phone calls warning that American economic dominance was slipping away. And they were right. Because while Trump fought workers at home and allies abroad, a new economic world order was quietly taking shape. A world without American control, the death of dollar dominance. This wasn't just a sell-off, it was the end of an era, as the American economy buckled under the weight of tariffs, inflation, and political division. A historic shift unfolded behind closed doors. Japan, China, and Russia announced a joint proposal to create a new global financial system, one that would no longer revolve around the American dollar. The proposal was simple but devastating. A new international currency basket, backed by a coalition of Asian and Eurasian economies, designed to replace the American dollar as the world's primary reserve currency. For decades, the strength of the dollar had given Washington unparalleled global power. It allowed America to run massive deficits, sanction its enemies, and control global trade. That privilege evaporated the moment Japan joined the rebellion. Other nations followed. India, Brazil, even some European Union states began to quietly reduce their dollar reserves. International trade agreements shifted toward the new system. Oil contracts, once exclusively priced in American dollars, started to be negotiated in alternative currencies. The financial empire America had built over 75 years began to crumble, not with a bang, but with a whisper. Washington could no longer dictate global markets. The Federal Reserve's decisions no longer determined world interest rates. And American consumers, used to the privilege of cheap imports and limitless credit, suddenly faced a new reality. Their money no longer ruled the world. The collapse of American confidence wasn't just political. It wasn't just economic. It was existential. A superpower that had dominated the global economy for 3/4 of a century now stood alone, surrounded by former allies who had decided they could no longer afford to follow Washington's lead. And the question left hanging in the air was simple, yet terrifying. Without dollar dominance, who would control the future? What do you think? Let's know in the comments down below and let's talk. Thanks.